I listen to a lot of podcasts, and for me, it's the ones that I feel like I'm learning. Because if I'm listening to something, I'm not reading something, I feel like I'm wasting time. But I did start listening to the presidential podcast, and Lillian Cunningham is on, who actually... Lillian, did you create this yourself, this idea for this podcast?
I did, yeah. I created it, I produced it, taught myself how to mix sound for it, yeah.
That's great. Listen, I love it. And I am a podcast nerd and obviously a broadcasting nerd. And I fell in love with the idea that every single president had and some are not an hour. There are presidents that popped into office quick and died pretty quick, and they get 30 minutes, But I love the fact that I could kind of sit down and learn about what other folks who have studied them actually thought about them, meaning what they were like as kids, what they were like in office, what they sucked at, what they were good at. And so before I ask you some questions, just know for me, love the podcast. I know it was recorded a couple years ago, but I just got into it and thought it was, for me, such a great listening experience, especially in the time that we're in right now.
Oh, thank you so much. That really means so much to me.
Is it weird, too, that people are just now discovering it and you had done this a couple years ago?
Yeah, it's really cool, right? That's kind of the dream. And, so I created it in 2016, the last time we had a presidential election. But even then, I had no idea so many people would go on to listen to it, but I was hoping to create something that was evergreen. That was part of the point, was like to cut through just the noise and the headlines of the day and to offer people something that just like enriches their understanding of the world around them. So it's cool to see that, it didn't date itself and it still feels really fresh and valuable to people.
Lillian is a Washington Post journalist and a podcaster. And so I just have some stuff before we talk into what the new episodes are, because I think a lot of my listeners on this podcast or my radio show aren't going to even know what the old episodes are quite yet. So I just want to kind of start from the beginning and ask you some general president questions that you may have picked up some answers during the time. Is that cool?
Cool. Yeah, great.
When you started this, were you a big president buff? Like, did you have a ton of presidential knowledge?
No, that I didn't. That was kind of the funny thing is I think people expect like, oh, you created this podcast about presidential history. You must have been like, one of those people who's read a biography of every president. And I was kind of the opposite. I'm someone like you, Bobby. Like, I'm someone who's just really curious. I love learning new things. But I always kind of felt like I had this gap in my knowledge about presidential history, like beyond just Lincoln and TR and like the presidents who you learn about in school. So for me, doing the podcast was in some ways like a personal quest to fill these gaps in my own knowledge, and hopefully along the way, to do the same for people who are listening to it.
Whenever I read Accidental Presidents, I was shocked that bad water was killing presidents. I was shocked. I could not believe it. And so,
isn't that crazy?
Talk about that for a second, how the tainted water supply killed a couple of presidents.
Yeah, this was something I had no idea about before I did the podcast. But, there are all these kind of tall tales about why some of the early presidents who died in office died. Like, there's a story about how William Henry Harrison caught pneumonia giving his speech, and that's what killed him 30 days later. And Zachary Taylor, ate a bad cherry. But it turns out that for a lot of these guys, the water supply in the 1800s to the White House was totally contaminated. It's gross. It's like there was a sewer behind the White House. And anyway, these current day medical detectives have gone back through the records and their symptoms and realized William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Abraham Lincoln's son, all of these deaths actually were caused by the contaminated water supply.
Wild.
Which is
just
totally
sewer.
wild.
Just basically they got killed by bad sewer as they're running our country.
Yeah.
Another thing
called DC the Swamp, but yeah.
that was wild to me was John Adams, right? He's the only founding father that doesn't have a monument. And when you think back about, and if I'm right, again, I didn't write a bunch of stuff down. I'm going from memory. Wasn't he the only founding father that didn't have slaves as well?
Yeah, I mean, he was the only, and early one of our presidents who didn't. Really incredible guy. And it's funny. I've seen, so the John Adams episode I did focused a lot on, both those great parts about his legacy and, speaking out against slavery. But then also the fact that he doesn't have a huge monument in D.C. like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington do. And it's been fun, like in the past 4 years, tons of people who've listened to the podcast have written to me to say, like, how do we start some sort of effort to get Adams a monument? So I don't know that it'll ever happen. Monuments I think we're kind of moving away from monuments these days that, put individuals up on pedestals, but it is cool that people are paying attention to things like that and thinking about, like, what are the legacies we actually should be celebrating here.
But when I hear you talk about Thomas Jefferson, again, I had read kind of the macro version of Thomas Jefferson's story, and he seemed like a fine enough guy. However, when you dig down into Thomas Jefferson, not a guy I would have liked hanging out with. Just does not seem like a good dude.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking to one of the guests on the podcast about that, and I had this question. I'm sure you've run into listening to the episodes there. For every president, I ask historians and biographers, like, what it would be like on a blind date with one of the presidents. And I do it partly to, like, throw the historians off their game a little bit, but also just because I think it gives really interesting insight to who these people are. And I remember the person I asked about Thomas Jefferson was like, you might go on a first date with him, but you would not go on a second date with him. Like, he is just not a guy you'd really find you wanted to spend a lot of time around.
And all men aren't created equal if you still have slaves, Thomas Jefferson,
Yep.
I mean, that's what we know him for saying, yet he still had hundreds of slaves. Let's talk about Warren Harding for a second. So,
ooh, yeah.
Some crazy scandals. Kind of walk over some of the Warren Harding scandals that if it happened today, well, I don't know. What's happening today is pretty crazy, don't get me wrong. But let's say if it happened 4 years ago, the place would have went berserk.
Yeah, I mean, Warren Harding, 100 years ago, 1920, he was elected. And I knew nothing about Warren Harding before I did his episode. And I did all of these, like, week to week in real time. And I remember the Warren Harding week approaching and thinking, like, oh, my God, what am I going to do about this guy? It turns out, like, there is so much to cover with him. I'm still hoping I'll get a call to, like, create a whole Netflix special about him because I think he's just insane. Well, let's see, the highlights. I mean, he died in office under sort of mysterious circumstances. He had this long-running affair with a woman who the U.S. government thought was a spy for Germany. He impregnated a young girl while he was president, and she had his child, and one of his good friends bought the Hope Diamond, and, like, tragedy befell, like, the family and all the friends. Several of his cabinet secretaries commit suicide in these really, like, shady ways. So it turned out like he was just like a crazy tale from start to finish.
Yeah, how is there not a series on him? Like, that right there is so compelling.
I really don't know. I would watch that. I would read that book. I would watch that Netflix show. I do think actually parts of Boardwalk Empire, that show that used to be on, had some stuff about, like, the suicides in his cabinet. But yeah, I mean, it's just a really dark, interesting chapter of American history that, like, none of us learn about in school. We just totally glaze over people like that. But there were tons of stories I came across, not all as wild as that, but a lot of these presidents we don't learn anything about had really interesting stories.
A lot of these guys have daddy issues, either dads who died before they were born, or dads who were absent, or were alcoholics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
what's the correlation here?
I mean, I was so struck by that doing the podcast because, as you said, I mean, part of these episodes, were largely about their time in office, but there was a good chunk of every episode that talked about their upbringing and sort of what led them to the presidency. And so inevitably, I learned about the childhoods of all of these future presidents. And I would say more often than not, they had some sort of rough childhood, some, difficult upbringing with like a single mother. I mean, the historians I talked to all had sort of different thoughts about it, but a lot of them, in sort of psychoanalyzing it, says like they sort of felt a need from a young age to be able to like step in and like fill a gap in the family, right? Like either their father had died and so they were responsible from a young age, from being more of like an adult in the family than they otherwise would have, or they, in some cases with alcoholic fathers, like they learned skills really early on about how to like cope with difficult people and difficult situations. And then also I think, some of it is just like a desire for a better life or to get out of there, like it bred people with ambition, and with a sense of wanting to sort of like escape and make something better for themselves.
You're back with episodes which I was shocked there would be more. I thought, well, we're pretty much out of presidents, but now the latest episode is actually the first time a woman was chosen as a vice presidential pick, which was 1984. So talk about that for a second and what actually inspired you to come back and throw some new episodes up.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a surprise to me too, right? Because the whole premise of the presidential podcast was that I went in order from George Washington through present day. My last episode in 2016 was the morning after Trump was elected. I put out an episode. So it felt like, for at least 4 years, it kind of reached the end of the line with the podcast. But I think part of what happened, is there are people out there like you who discovered the podcast a year, 2 years, 3 years after I made it. And the point of the podcast was always, to explore history in service of better understanding the present and giving people some context to understand like what's precedented and unprecedented in what they're seeing happen around them and happen in the White House. So it felt like even though we couldn't make more episodes about new presidents, that there was still kind of, especially in another election year, there was a role, a sort of public service role that I could fill by coming back in and saying, hey, there are plenty of other stories that relate to presidential history in some way that help illuminate what's happening around us today. And so, yeah, the most recent one was a look back at the 1984 election, the first time a woman was picked to be the vice presidential candidate for a major party. And I mean, it's fascinating. Both, you appreciate sort of how far we've come, and you also appreciate how history doesn't really move in straight lines, and, doors open, and then years and years go by before they reopen. So yeah, Geraldine Ferraro is a really interesting story too, and I had the chance to talk to Walter Mondale, who was the presidential candidate who chose her, and the former vice presidential candidate. He's 92 years old, and he did a Zoom call with me for the podcast to talk about why he picked her and
that's pretty cool.
What challenges he faced. So yeah, really cool to be able to do that.
Well, let me ask you we only have a couple minutes left, some pretty quick hitter questions, and they may not be that easy to quick hit, but let's see what we can do here. This is a big one though. Why was Abraham Lincoln not a favored president while he was in office?
I think that is true for a lot of presidents. I mean, I think I learned that, the really great leaders in our country tend to see beyond their moment and beyond the politics of the present. So I think in a way it's sort of by definition, if he was going to do something to dramatically improve the country and move it forward, kind of goes hand in hand with, doing things that in the present moment don't necessarily make you the most popular.
The biggest misconception that you learned is not true about a president. We think something, but it's actually just the opposite.
Ooh, geez.
Because for me, I'll give you a second to think about it. It's a big question to ask. Is that I just assumed Lincoln was loved. And then, you read he had to switch vice presidents. You start to go through all of, what was happening between the first election and second, and obviously the Civil War. And you realize that nobody really loved Lincoln at the time because of his ideals. And also what was crazy about Lincoln too is that, he, and you can check me on this, but he was up for freeing the slaves, but he wanted to take them and send them back to a place where they would be free, not keep them here. Do you know about that? Or am I completely wrong? Did I read a wrong? Did I read a wrong historian telling me something about that one too?
No, I think there's some of that in Lincoln's story. That reminds me a little bit of Monroe, who, anyway, long story, but he was pro sending slaves in America back to Africa. But yeah, I think, geez, for me, this is a tiny thing. This is not as big as something like Lincoln not being loved in the moment, but I was really surprised to learn that Thomas Jefferson hated public speaking. Because I think in my head, Thomas Jefferson, was one of those larger-than-life figures who started the country. He would have had, a ton of confidence and, presence. So I found it really interesting to learn that while he had a decent ego, he did not like being in front of a crowd. He did not like getting up and giving addresses. And I think these days it's a good reminder, how much the job of the president has changed, because these days you can't be president without feeling okay speaking in front of crowds, or even loving speaking in front of crowds. But it was such a different office back then that you could get away with not wanting to see anyone.
All right, I had a producer fact check me here. Here is the Abraham Lincoln block. Lincoln desired to return former slaves to Africa or other tropical regions with their consent and the accord of the authorities of the country where they were to be settled. He repeated his support for colonization numerous times, including during the American Civil War. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't wrong with that statement, because I would get fried if I was. Well, Lillian, I am a massive fan of the podcast, and I hope a lot of my listeners, I know a lot of my listeners were going over to it. I was getting tagged and stuff all the time with, especially right now as we get into another election. It's always best to learn about what happened. It helps you at least not be surprised with what happens next. History's a great indicator. So I encourage everyone to check out Presidential. She has some other podcasts too, if you like that. I have them here: Constitutional, which explores the Constitution, and Moonrise, which is an audio miniseries hosted by Lillian, and it digs into the nuclear arms race of the Cold War and the transformation of American society and politics. I gotta admit, I haven't got into that one yet, but I'm such a fan of Presidential, I'm probably gonna jump into Constitutional next. So Lillian, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Bobby. This was really fun.
Yeah, great to talk to you, and everybody check out Presidential. Bye, Lillian.
Bye, thanks.
Hey guys, it's Bobby Bones. Welcome to the channel. If you're new to the channel, subscribe and then go check it out. A lot of artists, a lot of songwriters, a lot of music. Welcome to the Bobbycast channel.